Welcome, everybody. My name is Tina Werkmann. I'm the chair of Labour Against the Witch Hunt, co-chair, and I'm also a member of the steering committee of the Labour Campaign for Free Speech, which is put on this meeting. It's a new campaign. It's a couple of months old, but I think we've already really seen in the last couple of weeks why this campaign is so very important. And I think with the latest attacks by Israel on the Palestinians, we have really seen what the campaign against Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party was really all about. It was about stopping any criticism of what Israel is doing by labeling it anti-Semitic, such criticism. I think the reaction of the mainstream press to the 200,000 strong London's demonstration a couple of weeks ago in support of Palestine certainly shows how this is being done. The Sunday Times ran a huge front page piece condemning the anti-Jewish hatred that was allegedly visible at the protest. And the full evidence of the article was 3 posters, they had pictures with it, that stated, Israel is the new Nazi state, one Holocaust does not justify another, and Netanyahu surpasses Hitler in barbarism. I think even under the IHRA misdefinition of anti-Semitism, one would struggle to find these posters anti-Semitic. Clearly, they were expressions of criticism of Zionism, of Israel, what Israel is doing, but not of Jews. So this conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is, of course, utterly deliberate. And we are examining tonight how it is finding reflection in our schools and universities and what we can possibly do about it. We're now in a situation where in a number of universities, academics and staff are under severe threat of suspension or worse for daring to speak out on Israel and Zionism. For example, in Bristol, Professor David Miller, who's not allowed to speak about his case. In addition, the government, as we all know, is threatening to defund universities who do not impose the misdefinition of anti-Semitism published by the IHRA, which has been designed to conflate anti-Zionism and criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. In the Queen's speech, it was kind of buried away, but we got a flavor of what the government is planning to do next. It did outline its plans to outlaw the BDS movement because, you guessed it, it's anti-Semitic. We've also seen school students are getting detention and being punished for putting up stickers that read Free Palestine, or putting on, wanting to discuss the issues, because apparently it's a conflict, with 2 sides, and there's the Palestinians, they're doing bad things, and the Israelis are doing some bad things, which is how they're trying to portray this conflict. It's not, it's a full-on assault by one side against another. So we're very pleased to have a number of very important and knowledgeable speakers on this issue tonight. It's a very important issue. The first person to address the meeting tonight is Professor Moshe Machover, who's also been in the crosshairs of the thought police in the Labour Party. And we're very pleased to welcome him tonight. Hello, Moshe. Hello.
Okay, very briefly, I want to mention some good news and a warning. The good news is that obviously the ground is beginning to shift. The support for the settler state of Israel and for its colonizing policies, which are expressed as apartheid and Jewish supremacy. Opposition to them is growing, and there is a split in the public that used to give it unquestioning support. This unquestionably began and is noticeable in the United States. And it is also reflected in things that are happening over here in Britain. I only want to mention very briefly the recent publications by Peter Beinart, who used to be an important voice for soft Zionism in the United States, and has now shifted this position and is advocating giving up the idea of a Jewish state, and more recently advocating the right of return of the Palestinian refugees. This is a big shift. Recently I've seen in The Guardian pieces that I hadn't expected to see anytime soon. Jonathan Friedland, who is the Zionist gatekeeper of The Guardian, came up with some pieces that, and obviously he wrote some editorial, unsigned editorial pieces in The Guardian that question his former position. More recently, they gave a platform to Michael Sfard, one of the human rights lawyers in Israel, who wrote a very good piece in the Guardian. Things that you wouldn't have seen in the last 3 or 4 years, anything like it in the Guardian. So within the American establishment, there is also some shift. I mean, there has always been a section of the American elite and the policymakers who disputed the mainstream idea that Israel is a strategic asset for the United States. I can only mention two quite important names, Walt and Mearsheimer, who wrote this famous book some years ago, disputing this idea. I mean, they pointed out that this American support for Israel has some costs. Obviously, any policy has some costs. I mean, the question is it worth it? They were and are still in a minority amongst the policy-making elite and the people who theorize it, who dispute the idea that American support for Israel and questioning and absolute support is worth the trouble. They point at the costs. They are still in a minority, but their voice is heard more clearly now, especially in an important journal called Foreign Policy, the United States. Some of you may be familiar with it. Walt has written a few articles recently in which he advocates his position. So there is some shift, and even if you follow very minutely the words used by Biden, you can see that there is some shift in this position. Okay, so this means that the front of absolute support for the colonizing project of Zionism is cracking. It is not as uniform, it is not as overwhelming as it has been. Does it mean that the attacks against people like us, against people who actually speak out, is the attack against us going to diminish? On the contrary, just because the supporters of Zionist colonizations are feeling that their side is losing ground, they are going to intensify their attack against anyone who voices support for Palestinian human and national rights. So we have to be prepared for intensification of this attack against us, besmirching anyone who speaks up for Palestinian rights and against Zionist colonization as anti-Semitic. What should we do? Organize, and we are being in this process of organizing as wide a support for free speech on Palestine and Israel as possible. let me mention finally, before I end up, a very good declaration on which I'm one of the signatories by Israeli academics in Britain in opposition to the diktat of Gavin Williamson against the universities explicitly. This is a statement explicitly directed in defiance of this unspeakable diktat by Gavin Williamson, and against the threat of academic freedom that it represents. This is online, and you can find it, and it has support of hundreds of Israeli academics. First of all, those active in Britain, but also elsewhere. There's external support from Israeli academics in Israel and in various other countries. So be prepared for intensification of the struggle. This is my message.
Thank you very much, comrade. That was excellent, as always. Our next speaker is Saladin Meckled-Garcia, who is, let me just find my notes, who is Vice President of the University and College Union at the University College London, and involved in a struggle with the IHRA misdefinition of anti-Semitism, which he's going to talk to us about. And he's had the pleasure of being featured in the Jewish Chronicle recently as well. Hello, Saladin. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I take it as a badge of honor that I was attacked in the Jewish Chronicle together
Absolutely.
with the president of my branch of UCU. In a way, I'm picking up. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, all good. Thank you.
Great. So in a way, what I'm going to say picks up exactly from where Moshe left off with regard to the intensification of the attacks. So many of you will know that there is a cultural / educational battle being fought in the universities with the imposition of this IHRA definition on anti-Semitism, which basically is a protect Israel definition of anti-Semitism, protect Israel from criticism. And there has been some pushback in the universities. It is claimed that something like 50% of universities have now adopted it. But what it's not clarified is how many of those universities have adopted the definition as a properly enforceable disciplinary code on what you can say and cannot say in your classes, in your research, and in your associative meetings on university campuses. There are many cases where universities have adopted the so-called definition of anti-Semitism in an attenuated way, what we could describe as firewalling it from being actioned in disciplinary proceedings and hearings. That is still imperfect as far as I'm concerned, because actually what happens is, even though you have a code that has a lot of caveats that says this will not be used for disciplinary purpose against academics and students, it can still be appealed to when looking into disciplinary measures because all codes have some valence once they are on the books of a university. But nevertheless, there has been some pushback. We've seen at UCL, my university, the academic board, which is the board of all the professors plus something like 400 academics formally can sit on it or do sit on it. There was a vote to replace it with something more suitable to academic freedom, because it's obvious that this encroaches on academic freedoms. The Open University more recently decided to adopt, the Senate of the Open University decided to adopt the Jerusalem Declaration on anti-Semitism, which is a more academic freedom friendly definition. I'm not going to say it's perfect. There's a lot of people who are critics of it, but nevertheless, it doesn't have the same kind of problems in terms of quashing discussions about Israel and its activities as the IHRA does. But, and there are others. SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, has rejected entirely the adoption of this definition. But as a result of the pushback, and also now, as we're seeing a result of the exposure of what Israel is doing in the world's eye because of events, activities, of course, there is an attempt to try and to target the people who are behind or support or facilitate these moves. So, for example, the Pinsker Center, and then I'm going to give everybody a link to look at a report which will be useful for your information, which the Al Jazeera, famous Al Jazeera film on the lobby exposed was being financed by AIPAC. Sorry, I'm having trouble getting my chat working. 1 second. Anyway, the Pinsker Center has produced a report that was featured in the Jewish Chronicle last week, in which it said basically that the universities that have adopted the IHRA definition, this is not good enough because they're not enforcing it. They're not implementing it fully. They're not using it to discipline their staff and students for things such as terrible statements of the following kind. I will quote. The statements, the ones which they identify as terribly anti-Semitic, include branding Israel an apartheid state, identifying Israel with colonizers and imperialism, saying that Israel is involved in global terrorism, that they are oppressors, or that they are even genocidal murderers, and so on and so forth. And high amongst the list of things that are anti-Semitic on the Pinsker Center's report is opposing the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism itself. That's one of the big anti-Semitic no-nos that you shouldn't be committing. So there is this pushback, and they want to pressurize universities to adopt, not only adopt the IHRA definition, but to start to enforce it and to discipline. And we see that now in the emergence and the flourishing, if you like, of cases where people are being attacked. Students and staff are being attacked for example, 5-year-old social media Twitter posts that say things like Israel is apartheid, this is ethnic cleansing, and so on and so forth. There are emblematic individuals that are being picked on to be attacked purposefully in order to get scalps and to make everybody else frightened, of making these kind of criticisms or analyses. So we know famously the case of Goldie Osuri at Warwick, who is being continuously attacked, and attacks against whom have heightened at the university. We know that at Warwick, there are more than 20 cases now going on where people are having their social media feed picked up for things like, using terms like apartheid, Israel, and ethnic cleansing. At Leeds University, there's an efflorescence of cases against people. Somebody compared in social media a while ago Netanyahu to Orban. They said, are both of these two Nazis? Is that why they hang out together? And that is taken to be a violation of the IHRA definition. But there are many, many more, and they're growing. And in order to get people on board, of course, they use the old tactics of smear and misrepresentation. I wish I could get my chat to work, because then I would actually be able to post something. But my favorite example of smear and misrepresentation, given that David Miller's name is on the billing, or is on the board for this meeting, is something that was said against David Miller. So there is a petition that's signed by some of my my less critical colleagues at UCL against David Miller, that's doing the rounds. And in the petition, it says, I quote, we believe that his classification of Bristol Jewish Society and the Union of Jewish Students as part of the movement he has described as an enemy to be targeted, that is Zionism, and his singling out of individual Jewish leaders within those organizations emphasizes the threatening nature of his remarks. So anybody in a university that saw that that somebody was saying these students must be targeted would feel, that this was a problem, right? You don't target students. This is violence, it's potential incitement, it's potential criminality and illegality. But when you actually make a transcript of the speech that they cite, the exact video that they cite where this was said, actually what David Miller said was that we must engage in Palestine solidarity. We must target the Zionist movement directly in order for Palestinians to win. Zionism as a philosophy, as an idea, as an ideology must be defeated. So what he said was basically, we should target this ideology to defeat it ideologically, as we would any other kind of racism. But of course, this is missed out from any of the reporting in order to smear someone like him as calling for basically incitement against students. There's a recent piece in the Times Higher by someone called Mintz, also from my university, again, engaging in whataboutery, as you will expect. One of the big arguments in it is, why are you so concerned with what Israel is doing? What about the Uyghurs? And saying the IHRA is necessary because apparently, if you don't have the IHRA definition in place, us terrible left-wing progressive academics will be doing what that light and bastion of intelligence and knowledge, David Hirsch, has said that we're doing, which is to try and use anti-Zionism as a loyalty test for whether other academics can be part of academia. So this is the level of the smears and claims that we're seeing in order to push back. What they want, by the way, is all of these newspaper articles, so-called reports by dodgy think tanks like Pinsker, to end up on the table of vice chancellors and their councils, and to frighten them with newspaper exposure into enforcing these definitions. At the same time, and I will end on this, I'm sorry if I've taken too long, at the same time, what we must be doing is highlighting and driving home the message to these vice chancellors that this definition and this approach to Israel-Palestine messaging and discussions on campus is not, adopting it is not a way of achieving peace and quiet on your campuses. It is a direct route to conflict, dispute, and potential lawsuits that they will definitely lose given the nature of that definition. And only by driving home that message and by campus activity, I note that the UCU this week in its Congress has taken a vote. The vote result isn't quite out, but I can guess what it is, to fight the IHRA definition full frontal and support all of those people who are facing attacks for their legitimate criticisms of Israel under the definition. So this is what we must do in order to push the VCs and the universities not to give up the culture battle against this pernicious definition, and again, allowing people to speak out on the actions of a violent, settler colonialist, ethnic cleansing state that we have seen in action in Gaza only last week.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Comrade. That was really heartening as well to see that not all universities just roll over, and quite a few do, and they've had a few fight back. The Labour Campaign for Free Speech has set up, or is in the process of setting up, a working group particularly focusing on academic freedom that Saladin is also, we're pleased to say, involved in. So it'd be really good if we can push this along. If anybody would like to get involved with this, please contact us. We also agree with Saladin's take on the Jerusalem Declaration. While it's not brilliant, not perfect, let's put it like that, it does at least try to deal with anti-Semitism, whereas the IHRA deals with Israel. It doesn't even try to tackle anti-Semitism and what it is about. So where it's been adopted, where the IHRA has been adopted, we do recommend that comrades could try and fight it by trying to get the Jerusalem Declaration applied instead, implemented instead. And we have a couple of motions on our website on this. Having said that, if there isn't one on your university or in your college or whatever your organization, then we wouldn't necessarily recommend that you push for the Jerusalem Declaration to be implemented, because there are laws against racism, etc. It doesn't need a special one on anti-Semitism. We're now coming to Esther, who's reading out a very good statement that's been sent to us by Stephen Sedley, who's the former Lord Justice of Appeal and a judge at the ad hoc, I don't even know what that is, of the European Court of Human Rights. And he's a visiting professor of the Oxford University, and he sent us a statement that Esther is now reading out.
Thank you, Tina. David Miller. It is now 5 years since the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA, published what it called a non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism, It is a clumsy piece of drafting distinguished by two particular features. It fails the first test of any definition by being open-ended and indefinite, and it is accompanied by examples, some of which are visibly designed to protect Israel from legitimate criticism. In spite of its self-description as non-legally binding, the supposed definition is rapidly acquiring the force of law by being used as a basis for witch hunts within institutions and organizations against bona fide critics of Israel. Ignoring the Home Affairs Select Committee's warning that the document, if unqualified, risks stifling free speech, government has set about enforcing its adoption by threatening to defund institutions which fail to adopt it. It may therefore be relevant to say a word about the IHRA and the genesis of its working definition. Although the IHRA is a publicly funded intergovernmental body based in Berlin, it publishes no minutes and does not reveal who attends its meetings. Among its first member states were the US, the UK, and Israel. Recent research, however, has established that the definition adopted by the IHRA's Bucharest plenary in 2016 consisted only of the two initial sentences taken from an abandoned document produced by a European predecessor body. The first, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. The second sentence elaborates the possible reach of rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism, but adds nothing by way of further definition. How then has the supposed IHRA definition come to include such examples as targeting of the state of Israel, conceived as a Jewish collectivity, and denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g., by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavour? So far as can be ascertained, the grafting on of the list of examples was the work of representatives of two uncompromisingly pro-Israel organisations, the Simon Wiesenthal Centre and the American Jewish Committee. There appears to be no evidence that the list was ever adopted by a plenary meeting of the IHRA. None of this has prevented it from being weaponised. Anti-Semitism, like pornography, may be easier to recognise than to define, but a straightforward and hard-edged definition, that is, hostility towards Jews as Jews. It is neither something as subjective as a perception, to use one of the IHRA's two inappropriate nouns, nor necessarily something as flagrant as hatred, to use the other. In neither instance is it coextensive with criticism, shared incidentally by many Jews worldwide, of Israel's laws, policies and practices, or of Zionism itself. Failure, or more realistically refusal, to recognise the legitimacy of such critiques is a gag upon freedom of thought and speech, a human right no less real than freedom from racial discrimination. Stephen Sedley.
Excellent. It's a really important statement, and we'll putting that up on our website as soon as possible for comrades to see. It's an important legal view there on this misdefinition. Okay, next speaker now is Deepa Driver, who's also of the University College Union and has a particular insight into the struggle against IHRA at universities. Hello, Deepa.
Hi, Tina. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I do feel a bit of an imposter here because many of the people who are on the panel alongside me are the people whose work I tend to read or try and understand or listen to in order to understand the Israel-Palestine question. So to speak alongside them seems a little bit uncomfortable, to say the least. But I'm here firstly to say that I'd like to show a great deal of solidarity with not just David Miller, but other colleagues across the academic space, both in higher education and in further education, who are coming under huge amounts of attack in terms of the clampdown on academic freedom. And this clamping down on academic freedom has its roots in a more marketized neoliberal approach to academia that has taken over most of the educational institutions that all of us work for. We see this on a day-to-day basis in terms of the fact that most of our colleagues, particularly our research colleagues, are on casualized contracts, even in the so-called Ivy League universities of Oxford and Cambridge, where staff, over 75% of staff in certain areas are on casualized contracts. When people are on casualized contracts and when they are dependent on, say, feedback forms from students, or when they are dependent on the largesse and generosity of managers to have a job the next year, it becomes very difficult to exercise academic freedom as we know it. And when we think of academic freedom, of course, it is intimately linked to freedom of speech. And both of these are essential to have a functioning democracy. In terms of academic freedom, our colleagues are owed the freedom in teaching and discussion, which is what you would expect in a place which is a cradle for knowledge, where ideas are tested, pushed away, broken down, or indeed strengthened and go on to a different level. They are meant to have freedom in carrying out research without commercial or political interference. And Gavin Williamson's statement clearly shows that there is a huge amount of political interference in the way our colleagues' research and our colleagues' expertise is allowed to be exercised. They also have a huge amount of commercial pressure arising from the fact that when people are no platformed or excluded from debate, or indeed as a result of their academic viewpoints, and we've seen this in people who are writing about abortion, in people who are writing about very sensitive and important topics, that they've even been excluded from jobs or research grants that they're bidding for. So it's a situation where people are extremely afraid to say what they really mean and to do the research that really matters. Our colleagues also have a right to disseminate their research findings. If we want academia not to be simply an ivory tower where we only talk to each other, then it is very important that work like David Miller's, which engages with reality, which seeks to help us to deliver justice, is allowed to have some amount of space in the real world. It is also important for us to be free of institutional censorship. At Leicester UCU at the moment, a huge swathe of our colleagues are being made redundant because the university in Leicester no longer wishes to have critical academics in certain spaces. I mean, in a situation such as this, academic freedom is under huge amounts of attack within where managerial positions are created solely with the idea of destroying knowledge and destroying the ability to engage positively and intellectually with any subject. Because if you are outside the agreed scope of debate, then you're not even wanted. Academic freedom also includes the freedom to participate in professional and representative academic bodies, including trade unions. At Leicester, for example, the university has just published a Q&A, which has told staff, which includes a suggestion to move away from UCU to other unions, which are more acceptable to management. So, this is what is happening in relation to the shutting down of the debate about Israel and Palestine and the crimes that are being committed is part of a wider picture where any debate which is critical is being toned down because either you have to reach a grant application, or you have to be acceptable to your managers, or you have to be acceptable to a range of students who will choose to be vocal and complain because they choose not to want to understand certain ideas. And this is really worrying because it pits different groups against each other. And in the case, for example, of David Miller and others, it pits people in situations where we're told that this is about protecting students. So it appeals to our instinct for justice, for doing the right thing by our students, which is, very core to any educator's basic commitment to not the sector, but the idea of education. So it's something that many people feel very uncomfortable and find it very difficult to challenge, which means that academia, if this trend of marketization, particularly entrenched in areas where critical debate is challenged, is allowed to continue in the way it is, then what we will have is a safe space where only certain kinds of debates will be allowed and where knowledge will not advance. I'm therefore keen that we should try and recognize that this is about is about using students as consumers, using staff as simply tools to progress whatever agenda management has in mind, and then these other people who are working in, as David has exposed, as many other scholars have exposed, who are working in networks, using those levers to shut down any debate that they oppose. And in this case, it is racism against Palestinians. And we as a community need to come together in order to rebuild democracy, we need to be able to rely on centers of learning, centers of knowledge, to develop that knowledge. And to be able to do that, we need to be able to grant certain freedoms and preserve them. And as Saladin said, UCU has certainly, I was at Congress on 3 days over the last week, and I was really inspired by the range of contributions that were made in relation to the acceptance of the IHRA definition, or rather the rejection of the IHRA definition, and the recognition that the Jerusalem Declaration is not necessarily the right alternative, but also a huge and deep recognition that we have to preserve a broader commitment to democracy and anti-racism. So on that,
excellent. Thank you. Sticking to time. Thank you, Deepa. I think the question of censorship as well as self-censorship is, of course, goes to the crux of the matter, isn't it? It's about stopping people from speaking up. You pick on a few prominent cases so that others don't even start speaking up. So that's why it's really important that we support and stand up those who are now being picked on, because if David Miller is being sacked or even suspended, that will open the floodgates to many, many more cases. So it's really important we highlight this and speak up about it as much as we can and as many areas as you can. So if you can write letters to newspapers, speak in programs that you attend, in meetings, please do, and spread this message that we won't be silenced. The next speaker is Tom Hickey, who is a member of the British Committee for the Universities of Palestine, or BRICUP in short. Thank you for joining us, Tom.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I've been asked to speak about the work that BRICUP has been doing. BRICUP, a committee of about 20 plus academics who work closely with the Boycott National Committee in Palestine and the Palestinian campaign for the cultural and academic boycott of Israel. I've been asked to speak about that, but I just wanted to start with a little an aside, really. This morning I was speaking to a close friend of mine in Istanbul, who was telling me that way back in the 1970s, what turned him from a young Jewish boy who had a future of Zionism already mapped out for him into the anti-Zionist and socialist he became, was reading a collection of essays edited by Moshe Machover. And it did just occur to me that were that collection of essays to be published now, and were the university from which Moshe was writing it to have adopted the IHRA, then Moshe would find himself, I suspect, in the in the sights of those who would want to get rid of him. The threats to academic freedom in the UK are that serious. The threats to the autonomy of universities are being threatened by Williamson, and the threats to the independence of intellectual inquiry are real and are currently great. We have in the UK a government that has committed itself in the next parliament to bring forward legislation that both requires universities to guarantee freedom of speech on the one hand, and also in separate legislation to outlaw the boycott of Israel, and to seek, presumably therefore, to outlaw the advocacy of such a boycott as well. It is, of course, shameless hypocrisy. What it really represents is part of the government's woke agenda, as they like to call it, the culture wars against what it characterizes as the Marxists of the cultural left. That it is part of such a political campaign is clear from the fact that legislation on free speech is completely unnecessary, since that obligation is already contained in the Education Act 1988 and other legislation, and indeed in the statutes of most universities. Legislation against anti-Semitism is unnecessary because it's covered by various of the race relations and associated acts, and because boycotts of Israel, whether they be cultural, academic, or commercial, because of Israel's apartheid policies, etc., are not anti-Semitic unless the whole question is prejudiced in advance by assuming and adopting the incoherent presupposition that opposition to Zionism as a political ideology or opposition to Israeli policy constitute some form of anti-Semitism. Responding to that threat to academic freedom and defending the right to advocate for Palestine has been at the core of what the British Committee for the Universities of Palestine has been engaged in for well over the last decade, I think. BRICUP is part of a consortium of organizations, including the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, Jewish Voice for Labor, Free Speech on Israel, Independent Jewish Voices, Jews for Justice for Palestinians, etc., who commissioned a legal opinion on the use of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and on its examples. BRICUP has produced documents for circulation to UCU branches on how to resist the adoption of the definition. It has, in conjunction with the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, contacted every Vice Chancellor in the UK at least twice now. It has held webinars to arm colleagues with interpretations and arguments, and to cohere, an attempt to offer a contribution to the coherence of a campaign in the HE sector. And it has been instrumental in securing overwhelming support for motions at Congress of the University and Colleges Union that commits the union to defending members' academic freedom and the right of every member of a university community to criticize Israel and to criticize the very idea of a confessional state, that especially one that is in this case discriminating against the indigenous population. And as Deepa has observed, voting is currently taking place on this year's Congress motion that includes motions on Palestine and motions on the IHRA. The legal opinions that exist, the two major legal opinions that exist, one from Hugh Tomlinson QC, are quite clear on the nature of the definitions. The definition has no legal standing, Tomlinson says, that public bodies, including universities, already have statutory duties to respect and ensure the right of free expression and assembly. And Tomlinson goes on to observe that reliance on the IHRA definition and its examples in order to ban or to restrict events critical of Israel, but which express no hatred for Jews as Jews, would actually be unlawful. Jeffrey Robinson QC, preparing an opinion for the Palestine Return Center, argued even more dramatic criticisms of the definition. He argues that it fails to address the most insidious forms of hostility towards Jewish people, and it is so loose and confused that it is likely to chill legitimate criticism of Israel and coverage of human rights abuses against Palestinians. And those opinions are in the hands of vice chancellors, they're in the hands of the UCU. But it remains the case, and the government is aware of it, of course, that the government is pressing ahead. Critical here, we in BRICUP think, is to take this debate now out of any silos of perhaps moribund trade union branches, if they happen to be moribund, or out of Labour Party wards that have been silenced, and to somehow drag this out into the universe of debate that constitutes a public sphere, and to do that by going onto the offensive. To win the argument, in other words, publicly, in union meetings and in conferences and in localities, and amongst students in universities too. It is, in other words, to emphasize the fact that it is us who are the defenders of free speech and not the government. We know, of course, that there is no such thing as an absolute right to free speech. No absolute right to it at all. That indeed is what separates us from the right-wing common sense group of conservative MPs who want to abolish, for example, the Race Relations Act in favor of complete free speech, in order presumably to allow Tommy Robinson a free hand to say whatever he wants to say on demonstrations and on television or in his interviews. We know that there can be no freedom of speech for fascists, no freedom of speech for racists, no freedom of speech for Holocaust deniers, unless we wish to allow the destruction of all the democratic freedoms that we enjoy. That doesn't mean that there is an argument for the no platforming of anybody and everybody we happen to disagree with. The no platforming policy was directed at the fascists and racists who attempt to deny freedom of speech to some and ultimately to everybody and not to anybody else.
But I want to ask you to wind up now, comrade.
Okay, BRICUP is now involved in attempting to help UCU branches to respond by opposing the adoption, if it hasn't yet been adopted in their universities, to rescind the adoption if it has already been adopted. And if there is some reason why a university believes, its academic board or senate believes that it needs to have a specific definition of anti-Semitism, then to seek one other than the IHRA definition. And the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism would seem to us to do the job extremely well.
Thank you very much, Tom. Excellent. I should say there's a bit of debate in our organization on the absolute right to free speech or not. I'm not on your side, I must say. I'm more on the side of absolute free speech, because who is a racist? Who is a fascist? Who's making these distinctions? We've been called racist. We've been called anti-Semites over the last 6 years. So I'm very dubious about allowing anybody to say he's a racist. His view cannot be heard, possibly. I think it's much better to drag these things out in the open, have discussions in the open, and perhaps you can also change people's views in the process. We're very pleased to welcome Salma Yaqoob as our next speaker, anti-war activist, amongst many other things she's done. She spoke at the huge pro-Palestine demonstration in London a couple of weeks ago, and she was fantastic as always. Hello, Salma, great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Tina, for that warm welcome. And can I just say a big thank you to all the panelists who've spoken so far, such brilliant contributions. I've been making notes throughout, Deepa, Moshe, Tom, Salahuddin. It's so inspiring to hear about the great work that's already being done, and that's why meetings like this are so important. So many people are feeling disheartened, and some of the chilling effect is working, because that's what it's there to do. It's to try and stop people feeling that they can have a voice and that they should have a voice. I mean, speaking personally, I had to think, 3, 4, 5 times before agreeing to come on this platform, and I have to reach into my own courage every time. It's not always an easy choice. It's just this last week, since I spoke at the last Palestine demo, that I have been called, in a national newspaper, the Telegraph, somebody who is a threat to multiracial Britain. I have my words deliberately smeared and misrepresented on a regular basis every time I speak out on this issue. So it's a commitment I have to make time and time again, and I feel hugely privileged to join this platform. The people have already spoken, and of course, we're waiting to hear Ilan and Norman, who have made huge sacrifices simply because they have been championing freedom of speech, not just for themselves, but importantly for those who have been silenced and dispossessed, the Palestinian people. So this is not an academic argument anymore, if I can use that analogy. I think for many people on the panel and in the audience, this has now become very personal, because our own freedoms to speak up have been compromised, are being pushed back. I was always proud to join the anti-war movement. You know, it shows my age, way back in 2002, when we were extending our solidarity, using the freedom of speech we have in this country to speak up for those who didn't have the same voice, whether it was in Afghanistan or Iraq. Right now, that battle, that censorship, that silencing, that occupation of political space, if I may say, you know, has come to us in this country. You know, many people here will know the kind of history of this country, but one of the things we can be proud of is that whilst, you know, we know about the history of colonization and imperialism, in this country, we have enjoyed freedoms to speak up. It's been called the mother of democracy because it has delivered to some extent, you know, forms of democracy which other countries have been envious of. And yet these are the very freedoms that are now under attack. So actually, unless we all speak up now and forcefully and confidently and unapologetically, we will actually be silenced forevermore. That's what I believe is at stake. And I agree totally with Moshe when he says there's good news and bad news. The fact that we are on this back foot at the moment, the fact that we have come under such attack, I believe is actually a result of the fact that we have managed as a movement to put those who champion settlement, who champion occupation, who champion division on the back foot. And that's why we have to expect, and we have to gird ourselves, friends, for an even more vicious backlash. Jeremy Corbyn was ignored for many years when he wasn't seen as a threat. But when he became leader of the Labour Party, he was saying nothing different from what he said for the last over 30 years. But because he was becoming close to power, close to taking government, when the results of 2017 came in, a vicious witch hunt was launched. And we've seen the effects of that, to the point that now former leader of the biggest party in Europe still has his whip removed. That's where we've got to. So we're up against some very, very real forces. And we've seen now that push against academics like David Miller, and we've heard about others. People are now being made emblematic trophies. Corbyn has been picked out on purpose to deter any other politicians from talking about Palestinian rights, from criticizing Israel. Everybody on this call knows it's not about anti-Semitism or anti-racism. It's about Israeli impunity. It's about a political program. And I will say it is not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel, just as it is not Islamophobic to criticize regimes like Saudi Arabia. But that conflation has been deliberately and mendaciously introduced in order to silence the very opposition and standing up for humanity that we're seeing. And they're on the back foot. Why? Because actually this new generation, even before the huge mobilizations that we've seen very recently, a new generation has woken up. It started with a great anti-war movement when we saw the largest protest movement in human history, not just here in the UK, but across the world, when people came together to say, not in my name, standing in solidarity with the Iraqi people who were being bombed under false pretenses. That the issue of Palestine became something people became more aware about. But this new generation, just as with climate change, just as with the links between the economy, Deepa very profoundly showed the links with neoliberalism, what's happening here. There is, I believe, also a similar link with imperialism. And young people are standing up and saying, not in our name. Young people's trajectory is towards progressiveness. And that's what's frightening the old guard more and more, which is why they are becoming more and more vicious and using the levers of power that they have to deny the democracy, to deny voice, to deny agency, and to bring in this disillusionment and a feeling of apathy and powerlessness, whilst driving down economic progress to keep people poor, to keep people divided, to keep people having away from any space to even think about what freedom, what political rights, what human rights, and what solidarity can mean. So whilst I'm not naive at all about the pressures and the challenges we have, I actually feel optimistic for the longer term. I know that history is on our side. And just as there's a slavery that Africans were subjected to, just as the apartheid regime in my living memory, these will become, the Israeli apartheid regime, I believe, in its present form, will become a footnote in history within the next generation, if not the generation after. But we have a battle right now where people are being silenced because those people can see that trajectory. So we have to stay firm. You know, I'm reminded of, I mean, it may sound like a specious analogy, you know, with the Lord of the Rings, where it's we've got to hold that door, guys. You know, we're at that point, but the real victory is in sight, and we have to keep making those hard sacrifices. But we're not alone. And that's the message I really want people to take away from. Three very simple, practical steps. You know, I don't need to analyze, you know, how bad things are here to this audience. Number one, keep speaking up and keep asking for and demanding freedom of speech, not just for people who agree with us. And that's why I perhaps may go further than some of the speakers so far. I think it's the left and those who are progressive who get most silenced by any laws which talk about curtailing freedom of speech. I think we have nothing to be afraid of. Let's bring out any ideas. I feel confident about challenging the real racists, but let us push back. And I think we need a coalition wider than just a pro-Palestinian solidarity movement, wider than the left. There are people on the right who are also worried about these so-called culture wars, whether it's around issues around transgenderism, about feminism. There are many, many people who are feeling silenced and driven out of public space. And we don't have to take a position on those issues. I think we have to take a position of allowing freedom of discussion and debate and freedom to get things wrong and to make mistakes. That's what being human is about, that we can then learn and challenge. And, you know, people in academia, whether it's at the university level or it's at primary school level, whether it's in secondary school or even in the home as parents, surely part of nurturing the next generation is about being able to debate ideas, question, learn, make mistakes, and grow. A punitive censorship, silencing and removing freedom of speech can never end up in anything good. And I think that's the direction we're going down. And I think we can have more allies than at present. Number two, when it comes to lobbying the government, do so forcefully, do so collectively. We have important petitions going in to sanction Israel, just as we've had for other regimes, you know, whether it's Saudi Arabia in the present or South Africa in the past. We must, again, stop apologizing and say that our government's involvement, the reason I'm going on about Israel, because it's my taxes which are being used to fund those weapons going out from this country to enable the occupation to go on. So where our voice as citizens is important, as well as, of course, the historical linkage Britain has to this very issue. But for me, it's a very concrete reality. Right now, Palestinians are being killed, tortured, maimed, with weapons being made in this country. We have a moral and an economic case to say not in our name, which brings me to the third point about direct action. I congratulate those people who are not waiting around for the governments to take action. We're living in democracy, so I'm saying let's lobby, let's petition, let's get the MPs to speak up, but also let's not wait around for them to do the right thing. And that's why those actions, whether it's in the Albert factories, in Sheffield, in Leicester, where people are highlighting actually how these things are being made here and going out, we must make it unpleasant and not so easy for people to be making profit at the expense of innocent people. And by doing so, a precedent is set around the world. And so there are many things that we can do. We are not disempowered here. We still have a voice here in the UK, probably greater than many other people in other parts of the world. So whilst we are under attack, whilst it is difficult now, I mean, I have a fantastic job in the NHS, which I love, and I'm all about reducing health inequalities day in, day out. And a part of me has to question, do I come on platforms like this because I know that I'll get pressure in that job? I'll have people coming out to try and silence me in so many ways. So we have to make these difficult choices. But I think I cannot be about addressing inequalities in my hometown, in my country, if I'm not prepared to stand up and speak about inequalities anywhere. And I just want to leave you with two quotes, one which I have to reflect on as a Muslim very regularly and which continues to inspire me. It's a verse from the Quran, chapter 4, verse 135, which I remind myself of as soon as I start to lose a bit of courage or hope. Stand up for justice, even if it goes against yourself, your family, kith or kin, rich or poor. And for me, that's very deep and profound, because it's not about standing for justice just because it suits you. Sometimes there's a price to pay for standing for justice. It's not easy. And my final quote would be from Martin Luther King, who I know is quoted always, but I came across this quite recently, and it really speaks to me at this time. Our lives begin to end the day we stay silent about things that matter. Our lives begin to end the day we stay silent about things that matter. So thank you for everyone on this call. Join the campaign for free speech. Sign up, keep speaking up, take courage for one another. We are not alone. They are few. We are the many. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Salma. That was really heartwarming. Fantastic contribution. I agree with pretty much everything you said there. No to zero tolerance and no platforming. I think that's actually the tool of our enemies, and shouldn't be our tool. I think we can defeat stupid ideas and perhaps even win over some of these people who have stupid ideas or their followers by showing how stupid their ideas are. We shouldn't be scared of them. Fantastic ideas. Direct action on, we're supporting a lobby of the Labour Party NEC on July 20th in London, putting out more info of that soon. I have comrades come along. Also at Labour Party conference, we're organizing, helping to organize the Resist Festival, where we want to put on free speech events around a number of issues. There's a website that perhaps Esther could put in the chat now as well, where I hope comrades can get involved and directly show, we are the opposition. It's not Keir Starmer, he's putting on a really sad show, but we are the actual real opposition, all of us. And it does come at a price, as Salma put so very well. But unless we do it, there's a much bigger price to pay in the long term. I'm very pleased to welcome Ilan Pappe now to address this meeting. He's an Israeli historian and works at the University of Exeter, and has also been coming under plenty of attacks by the right. Hello, Ilan. Thank you for joining us.
Hello. Thank you. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with such a distinguished speakers, and it's a very tough mission to follow such excellent contribution, which to my mind actually covered everything that has to be said on the topic. So I'll try not to repeat anything that was said and just add a few aspects that may shed light on some different ways of dealing with it without at all negating everything that was said until now, which of course was very wise, inspiring, and empowering as well. I will make three major points and then maybe just one piece of information. The first point I want to make is that in the struggle against the silencing and the stifling of any conversation of Palestine, sometimes the role of professional academics who actually need to teach Palestine as part of their curriculum, part of their career, but that's what they're expected to do, because they are either historians of the Middle East or historians of colonialism, or they are anthropologists or economists of the Arab world. So these people are still missing from our campaign. Not all of them, because some of them are very much with us, but not many people on BRICUP, for instance, the main society that represents the experts in Britain on the Middle East. Not all of them are very active, although I do think many of them support what we are doing. And it's very important to establish even more profound connection with them, because I think that while the government can use all the tools that were mentioned to silence an activist meeting on Palestine, it would find it very difficult to shut down the center that I founded in 2007 for Palestine Studies, which is an academic center, part of the many centers that the university has for focusing on particular areas of inquiries which are regarded legitimate and valid. And we need many more such centers or outfits or whatever form that they will take, it would be much more difficult to prevent an academic conference by scholars who teach and research the Middle East conflict, colonialism, genocide, or imperialism, if they want to have a conference that compares Israel to apartheid South Africa. If you'll have an activist conference, you will insist on an activist conference in the university campus, which you should fight for, you are much more exposed to the kind of weapons that now the government is using. I don't think that these academic outfits or these academics conventions would be done by people who know more than the activists. God forbid. No, I'm not saying this, but I'm just saying it's more difficult to target them, and that's why we need to enhance that kind of activity. I'm also saying this out of now 14 years of experience of doing it in Exeter. I always ran into trouble when I did it as part of activism in university. And again, I want to stress this should not be given up. It was much difficult to defeat my and my colleagues' projects when we did it as academics, which is also another layer of importance, because you want to say that research is one that a valid professional academic research is the basis for accusing Israel of being settler colonial state, of being an apartheid state, of committing ethnic cleansing and genocidal policies in Gaza. These are not just positions of activism born out of commitment and moral stance, they are also the result of an academic research, which is something that really gets the Zionists into a whirlwind of rage, and they do all they can, and so far they have not been that successful on that particular field. The same is true about journalism, where we are really finding it very difficult to find brave journalists who would, I'm not talking just in op-ed here and there, but who would really understand their moral commitment and professional commitment to report things on the ground as they are. It's very interesting that while there are quite a few Israeli Jewish reporters who are the main anchor and ports of call for TV stations and newspapers, and this is not just about Britain and the United States, but also in Europe, there are very, very few Palestinians who are asked to be the reporter on the ground for Palestine. The worst is probably the French TV 24 that only uses Israelis in Tel Aviv to explain what's going on in Nablus. The second point is that, and I'm sure we're all aware of it, while we should, of course, put our energy on free speech, I think that we should try also remember what goes on in Palestine, because sometimes it's a matter of energy, time, and effort. And after all, the free speech is a means for convincing people to pressure their governments to do something about Palestine and showing solidarity. And I think that we need even more events on Palestine itself as much as we need the events to protect freedom of speech. My third and last point, before I just want to give you a piece of information that might interest some people, I think one of the possible framework, which I think has already been done in a way, I just want to highlight it, is to fight or to go into this struggle not under the terms that are dictated by the Zionist lobbies and their supporters. The main frame that the Zionist lobbies in Britain and in the United States offer all the time, and also elsewhere, is the exceptionalism for racism against Jews, wherever they are. Or if you want, exceptionalism for anti-Semitism. We should insist that we are all involved in a fight against racism, wherever it exists, and change that conversation. Racism, and despite the nice things that Salma said about Britain, I think racism in Britain is still very rife. It's still very bad. I don't think that it is much better than racism in Israel. I think that it's the historical source of that racism is as evil and one that has to be tackled and still is not tackled by the British educational system or the universities enough, as one should tackle the origins of settler colonialism and racism in Israel. It's important to talk about all the genocides together. We should not, I don't believe that we should cave into this exceptionalism also in our calendar of commemoration. I don't think the African Holocaust should be second rated next to the Jewish Holocaust. Genocide is genocide. Ethnic cleansing is ethnic cleansing. Massacring people, even massacring people in the Grenfell Tower, is as bad as burning a Palestinian family alive. Jewish racism is a possibility, not an impossibility. But we are allowed to talk about, we should be allowed to talk about Jewish racism as much as we talk about Christian racism, Buddhist racism, Muslim racism, not just kind of defend ourselves by saying, you know, Zionism is an ideology and so on. Some religious interpretation are part of the problem of racism, and some ideologies are part of the problem of racism. So it is racism that we tackle wherever we find it, and not an exceptional case of racism. And I think that would help us to determine the conversation, its boundaries, its topic, and not just to react. As I say, I'm not inventing the wheel here. I think many of us are doing it. I just wanted to highlight it. Similar, and with this I will finish that point, the last point. Similarly, I think that we have to stress the point that the Arab world is in deep need for a conversation on human rights and civil rights. The atrocities that happened in the Arab world in the last 7 to 8 years means that people in the Arab world want an international conversation on human rights and civil rights with them. But this cannot be done if there is an exceptionalism, and in one place, human rights and civil rights are not discussed within the general discussion on the abuse of human rights and civil rights in the Arab world. This is something I think we should insist either through conferences, through our conversations with politicians, and so on. The exceptionalism of Israel is one more reason that you cannot struggle properly against the violation of human rights and civil rights in the Arab world. And the final point I would make, I just want to tell you that together with forensic architecture, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the outfit, but together with forensic architecture, our center decided to build an index of suppression because we believe that even the smallest instances of stifling a debate, of firing someone, intimidating someone, they all have to be shown in an accumulative way, as a narrative, as something that is happening and is happening all the time, and do this index rather than the index of anti-Semitism, and say this is the important index. This is the index that shows you how widespread and how negative and destructive is the attempt to stifle the debate and threatening people with their livelihood and jobs, and that this is a widespread phenomenon that is not accidental. It is managed from Tel Aviv. It is orchestrated. It is purposeful. And with this I would finish, as Moshe Machover told us, and I think he's right, because of our success, this kind of assault, which is a structured assault, which is a systematic assault, will become worse. And this should be taken alongside the recognition that because in the last 2 or 3 weeks, the younger Palestinian generation on the ground tasted for the first time, the younger generation, tasted for the first time the thrill of the mini uprising, the unity that it brings, the sense of self-respect that you can derive from it. Because of that, It is the introduction for the bigger one that is coming. It's coming our way. The third uprising is coming, and it won't take very long before it erupts. And the Israeli reaction accordingly would be horrific and cruel and more callous than any Israeli reaction before that. And that's why we should be aware also where the dangers are, who is really at risk, and what can we do as much as we can do on the basis of everything else we have done in order to be there and hope that we can contribute something to a better life, a normal life in Palestine on the ground. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Go ahead. Thank you, Ilan. Fantastic. If you're staying in the meeting, perhaps you could put some links to your institute and what you mentioned in your talk. That would be fantastic. Talking about exceptionalism, I'm German, as I'm sure you've noticed, and we get taught the exceptionalism in and out in school, as you can imagine. And I've read a very eye-opening book when I was about 19 years old. It was the Holocaust Industry by Norman Finkelstein. If you haven't read it, I really recommend it. It was fascinating, to put it mildly. It really opened my eyes about what happened in the aftermath of the Second World War and how the tragedy of the Holocaust was remade for a particular purpose. So we're very, very pleased to welcome Norman Finkelstein here to address this meeting. Hello, comrade.
Well, thank you for having me. I'll try to keep within the time limits, and I'm going to speak on three topics. First, some historical background. Secondly, a few comments about freedom of speech. And then lastly, to talk about the new opportunities regarding the public discussion of the Israel-Palestine conflict. First of all, the history. Now, Salma said she revealed her age when she went back to 2002. I'll reveal my age by saying I'll go back to 1982 when Israel invaded Lebanon. Up until 1982, Israel clearly dominated public discourse, or Israeli propaganda dominated public discourse on the Israel-Palestine subject. There was very little scholarly literature that defended the, so to speak, Palestinian or Arab point of view. Things only started to change quite significantly in 1982 with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. People forget, it was actually, by Israeli standards, it was by far and away the worst of the Israeli invasions or massacres that people are familiar with. The estimates are between 15 and 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinians, overwhelmingly civilians, were killed. And there you saw, over a 3.5-month period, culminating in the Sabra and Shatila massacres. And there you saw the first slice of public opinion. It was pretty small, maybe 5%. You would call it the old left and parts of the new left, and now moved away from ironclad blind support for Israel. The second major turning point was the first Intifada, 1987 to roughly the years they give are 1987 to 1993. Then Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, which climaxed with the Goldstone Report, which was, I would say, the third major blow to Israeli propaganda after the Lebanon War and the first Intifada, was Operation Cast Lead. Surprisingly, for reasons which I think are inexplicable, at least to me, Operation Protective Edge in July, August 2014 did not result in a large change in public opinion. And in fact, the human rights organizations were very weak in their depiction of what happened in 2014, even though it was in a much, you would say it was quantitatively, maybe not qualitatively, but certainly quantitatively much worse than Operation Cast led in 2007-8, Operation Protective Edge evoked very little change in public opinion. And the same thing is true, again, surprisingly, of the Great March of Return beginning in March 2018. It had very little resonance internationally, including within the Palestine solidarity movement. In the United States, there were no demonstrations in support of the nonviolent civil resistance in Gaza. In the UK, there was a little, but certainly not significant, and not nearly on the scale of Operation Cast Lead in 2007-8. And then the next big change comes with the last Israeli massacre in Gaza, what they call Guardian of the Walls, beginning on the 10th of May and extending till May 20th. And that was a very strange thing, frankly, from trying to analyze shifts in public opinion, because this was the first case where Israel actually did have prima facie, on the surface, it had a credible case of self-defense, because it didn't provoke directly the projectile attacks from Gaza. They were an initiative from Hamas, in my opinion, perfectly legitimate, but nonetheless, it wasn't like past Israeli operations. And nonetheless, it had a phenomenal, or registered, maybe didn't have, but registered a phenomenal shift in public opinion in the United States and then across Europe. Yesterday, my colleague and friend, the comrade Jamie Sternweiner, he sent me a poll, a YouGov poll, on the shifts in public opinion during Operation Guardian of the Walls. And it was spectacular. I mean, it was like 41-point shifts across Europe. And as I said, it's an irony, because Palestinians had the best case, for example, during the Great March of Return. They were protesting an inhuman, illegal, brutal occupation, and it was overwhelmingly nonviolent. And the shifts in public opinion were, I would say, close to zero, which is the main reason why the Great March of Return failed. In any event, here we are now with quite, as I say, spectacular shifts in public opinion. And that brings us to our, or I should say, my next point, which is that as Israel began to lose the battle for public opinion, I would say it begins, as I said, in '82. It's most vividly expressed during the early 2000s. As Israel begins to lose the battle of public opinion, it begins to resort to strong arm tactics in order to suppress criticism of it. Up until that point, Israel was quite confident it could win in the court of public opinion, in the public sphere. And so, and there was an element of truth to it, because as I said, there was relatively little solid scholarship defending the Palestinian position, or I should say the truth position. I don't much care for the Palestinian position. There was very little solid scholarship, but as the scholarship started to make its way into the mainstream, revealing things about Israel which most people had never heard before and were quite shocked by, then Israel felt, and its supporters, they were losing the battle for public opinion. And as they began to lose it, they realized they would be exposed in a public forum. They began to work behind the scenes, putting pressure on administrations that they were going to pull their alumni contributions. And Jews tend to give. I mean, they are overwhelmingly liberal, not overwhelmingly, but significantly liberal in their orientation. They give money to museums, they give money to hospitals, they give money to libraries, and they give money to universities. And so when the phone calls start coming into administrations that we're not going to give anymore, that has a real impact. And so they started to use these strong arm tactics as they lost the battle for public opinion. Now they were going to start working behind the scenes in what frankly are thuggish ways, taking out the wrenches to break the kneecaps. On another front, when they saw they lost the battle for public opinion, they started to create new disciplines. So this discipline suddenly appeared called Israel Studies. How Israel can be a studies, I can't for the life of me fathom, but it was obvious that in the professional association, like in the US MESA, the Middle East Studies Association, they had lost. The leadership in those organizations and the rank and file, the constituency, were overwhelmingly sympathetic to Palestinians, and so they withdrew from the professional organizations where they normally would have been ensconced, and they started to create new fields like Israel studies, and alongside it, Holocaust studies. And places like Clark University started giving master degrees in Holocaust studies. How you can get a master's in Holocaust studies is beyond me. It's like getting a degree in the Irish potato famine. That's not a field. It's not a discipline. These are propaganda outfits in the university financed by wealthy Jewish backers. That was another part of the shift in academic public opinion. Israel is losing, and so now it tries to set up institutions, disciplines, so to speak, which are just propaganda outfits on the university campus. I would also like to make, just as a side note, I make a point as a side note, I don't think it's correct to focus on people who are denied tenure as an index of the strength of the other side, or people who are canceled, speaking invitations that are canceled. That doesn't register the reality. Most people will never get to the point of a tenure track job that's going to be denied them. Well before they even get to that point, they've been silenced. That's why they never get a tenure track job. I only got denied tenure, which is my claim to martyrdom, out of a fluke. I would never have gotten a tenure track job. It was just a complete fluke that, for reasons that are not at all worth going into, I got on this tenure track job. Otherwise, I would never have been denied tenure. The same thing with cancellations. The issue is not how many times a talk by you has been canceled. The real issue is how many people hesitate to invite you because of their feared repercussions. It's not the cancellation. It's the 10,000 people who hesitate and then ultimately decide not to invite you because of the feared repercussions. For each time a talk by me was canceled, and it happened often enough, for each time a talk by me was canceled, there were 10,000 where people said, we couldn't invite you. There was too much opposition to inviting you. We couldn't get the invitation. You're too controversial. You do this, you do that. So I think that when you focus on things like tenure denials or focus on things like talks being canceled, it's really just the tip of the iceberg. And it's not at all representative of the nature and the magnitude of the suppression that goes on. The real suppression is you never get offered a tenure track job. You never get invited to speak. So, and it's the same thing with a book review. The issue is not getting a bad book review. The issue is your book is never reviewed. That's the real censorship. And I think it's an optical illusion or a misapprehension to focus on the end of the process, that is to say, a tenured job that was denied you, a negative book review, a speech of yours that was canceled, and not to look at the beginning and middle of the process, which is you're a non-person before you ever get to the end of the process. On the question of freedom of speech, most of what I made notes on has already been said, so I'm going to just put it shortly and simply. I don't think there's any justification for any speech codes, any censorship whatsoever, except in two cases. One, the obvious case where the speech is a call to violence in a situation where that call might be imminently acted upon. So there are two conditions. It has to be a call to violence, and it has to be in a situation where that call to violence might be imminently acted upon. In the absence of those conditions, I see no justification whatsoever for any censorship, any curbing of speech. The only other case I make, and it's not a significant case, but nonetheless, I have to acknowledge it because it's important. I don't think any speech which is devoid, which is empty of any ideational content, devoid of any ideational content, should be defended. So for example, does somebody have the right to call a Black person a nigger, a Jew a kike, a woman a cunt in the name of freedom of speech? My answer is no, because those words don't have any ideational content. There's no idea there to analyze. They're the equivalent of a blow to the head. They're a club. And insofar as they have no ideational content, I see, it's completely legitimate in my mind to ban those epithets, those ad hominems devoid of ideas. Apart from that, I can't see any justification for curbing speech. One person mentioned this no free speech for fascists. I haven't a clue, literally, I'm being serious now. I haven't a clue what that means. First of all, I don't know of any two people, including the best scholars in the field, I don't know any two people who agree on what fascism is. I know that growing up, everybody I disagreed with was a fascist pig. That was the expression we used back then. So as a term, it has no meaning, no content whatsoever. It's completely vacuous and contentless. Number two, it's easily open to abuse. You call everybody you disagree with a fascist. Zionists, of course, whatever that is, Zionists are fascists. Therefore, Zionists don't have a right to free speech. And as I said, it ultimately is nobody has a right to free speech who disagrees with you. That's what it comes down to. And lastly, I think it's positively harmful, a platform like that. And I'm going to say things that you may not like to hear, but I'm going to say them anyhow. I want to decide for myself whether what a fascist has to say has any truth content or not. I want to be able to decide that. I don't want anyone to decide that for me. I want to be able to read the books by fascists. I want to be able to listen to fascists. I want to be able to process for myself the truth value or the worthlessness of what fascists have to say. I don't want anybody deciding that question for me. My mind is perfectly equipped to assess and process that information on my own. I don't want any Platonic guardians telling me what is the truth. I want to figure that out on my own, and I'm perfectly confident in my competence to decide that question for myself. And even if it's worthless, even if what they have to say is worthless, I happen not to believe it's worthless, but even if it were true that it were worthless, I want to hear their arguments. So I'm armed, I'm prepared. If fascism makes its way into the solid core mainstream of American life, I want to be able to answer it. I want to be armed, prepared to answer it. When I used to teach, I would teach every semester Mein Kampf. I did. I always taught Mein Kampf. I could show you if I move the camera, I have 3 copies of it in my bookshelf. First of all, I thought it was important for students to know Hitler's arguments. Second of all, some of what Hitler had to say was actually not uninteresting. If you ever read his chapter 6 on propaganda, I thought it was very well done. It stayed with me. It stayed with me, that's for sure. So why shouldn't I read it? I can't even grasp. I used to be a Maoist, so I know the mindset. But I'm an adult now. I've grown up. And I can't, at this point in my life, even grasp the concept of somebody bestowing on him or herself the entitlement to decide for me what I am capable of listening to, what I am capable of hearing, the presumptuousness of that, the arrogance of that, the pretense of that. I find it just completely breathtaking to tell me, to decide for me what I'm allowed to listen to, what I'm allowed to hear, what I'm allowed to process. I can't even fathom it at this point in my life. I can't fathom it, this mindset. Last thing, opportunities now. Public opinion has dramatically, I don't want to say public opinion dramatically changed as if overnight, suddenly people had an epiphany. There's something awful going on in that place. No, doesn't happen in the real world. It's an accretion, it's incremental. And then as the expression has it, it reaches a, what's the expression they use with physics? It reaches a something point, not tipping point. It'll come back to me, old age memory. It reaches a tipping point, and in the oddest of circumstances, as I said, guardian of the walls, where Israel for the first time had a credible, on its face, a credible claim to self-defense, the whole world turned against Israel and its supporters. Like in my country, the Senate Majority Leader, Charles Schumer, he fell completely silent. Israel's strongest supporter for the last 40 years in the US Congress, now Senate Majority Leader, didn't utter a word in defense of Israel during Operation Guardian of the Walls. So there are new opportunities. How do I think the opportunities should be exploited? I would say the following things. Number one, just on the eve of Operation Guardian of the Walls, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, the Israeli Human Rights Organization, they legitimized a certain discourse, a certain vocabulary, which had been taboo in the mainstream up until then. I said in the mainstream. They legitimized the vocabulary, the discourse of apartheid. They said Israel, in the case of B'Tselem, they said Israel from the Mediterranean to the Jordan is an apartheid state. Human Rights Watch said in the occupied Palestinian territories, Israel is committing crimes against humanity, which amount to apartheid. They both legitimized the discourse of apartheid. Second, Human Rights Watch legitimized the discourse that Israel is a state built on Jewish domination. That's the expression they used throughout their 210-page report, Jewish domination. Israel is a state from the Jordan to the Mediterranean built on the principle of Jewish domination. B'Tselem it used the expression Jewish supremacy. Israel from the Mediterranean to the Jordan is now is a state, not now, is a state built on Jewish supremacy. So they legitimize terms and a whole discourse around concepts like apartheid, Jewish domination, and Jewish supremacy, which are real breakthroughs. They are real breakthroughs. It means the whole conversation in the dead center of public opinion, in the dead center of public opinion, no more the margins. The conversation in the dead center now can use a totally new vocabulary in order to try to, as Tina said, persuade, convince others that there's something egregiously wrong going on in that portion of the world. My last point is, if I were to make a suggestion, well, first of all, I would want to say, if I were to give a recommendation, simply a recommendation, and nothing more presumptuous, I would say the smartest thing now for the Palestine solidarity movement is to test those propositions on college campuses and force a public reckoning with this IHRA. So, what does that mean? You have a week devoted to, is Israel a Jewish supremacist state? Is Israel a state based on Jewish domination? Now, if you look at the IHRA definition, those public meetings should be disallowed. So, for example, one of the examples in the IHRA definition is denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. That's one of their examples. Well, if you read the Human Rights Watch report, they go back to 1947. They don't start now. The Human Rights Watch report goes back to 1947, and they say from the get-go, Israel was committed to creating a Jewish majority state, and in order to create that Jewish majority state, it expels 90% of the Palestinian population in the area that became Israel, and confiscated huge amounts of Palestinian land, both of those who were expelled and those who remained. You read the Human Rights Watch report, there is no way to get around the conclusion that in their view, Israel was a racist endeavor from the get-go, from 1948. Actually, they go back to February 1948 before Israel's even established. So to force the issue, to have events around, is Israel a Jewish supremacist state based on Jewish domination, which is contrary to what the IHRA definition says, and then force an issue. Are you saying that Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem are anti-Semitic organizations? Is that what you're saying?
Can you wind up now, please, Norman?
Yes,
Thank you.
Yes. And the last thing, I'll leave the last thing. The last thing I was going to say, but I'll just say, from my point of view, it makes much more sense to speak about Jewish supremacy and Jewish domination than to speak about apartheid. Because apartheid ended 30 years ago. It doesn't really mean much for the younger generations. And you end up in these very arcane academic discussions about what is apartheid. If you read the Human Rights Watch report, they define apartheid as domination plus oppression plus inhuman acts. That's their definition of apartheid: domination plus oppression plus inhuman acts. For anybody who's not in law, it's an impossible debate to get into. You have to define domination. You have to define oppression. You have to define inhuman acts. And by the time you finish defining them, you've put everybody to sleep. It's this technical, legal definition, which I understand because Human Rights Watch is a legal organization. It's involved in the law. But for a broad public, it just puts you to sleep. I say, let's stick to Jewish supremacy, Jewish domination. That conveys a very clear idea, easily documentable. What do you mean by Jewish domination? Well, according to Human Rights Watch, 93% of the land in Israel is reserved only for Jews. That sounds like domination to me. According to Human Rights Watch, there are 900 towns in Israel where you're legally allowed to deny any non-Jew the right to live there. Well, that sounds like Jewish supremacy to me. Very easy to communicate and very damning for the state of Israel. Okay.
Thank you very much, Norman. I have tour de force, but worthwhile listening to, as always. It was an interesting discussion in the chat, actually, while you were speaking. You probably didn't see it because you were speaking about the, are you critical of the BDS movement? And don't reply now, because we don't have time for this, but how it relates with the right to free speech. And it's certainly, it's a question there that could be debated. I'm also not an uncritical supporter of the BDS movement. It's certainly been the focus point of the struggle, in solidarity struggle with the Palestinians, certainly been very successful. But there is a question of boycott, academic boycott, etc., and how it relates to free speech. But we're a campaign for free speech, so we're discussing these issues. None of these opinions are out of bounds or shouldn't be discussed, etc. So I was glad to hear it. Also found it interesting your exception, the call to violence, that it could be immediately acted upon on. I'm a Marxist, a revolutionary. I can see myself in situations where that might become necessary, but you probably don't mean it like that, but there's issues we could discuss further. Let's not do it now. And I regret I've said it because we want to actually give comrades a chance to come back. Tony Greenstein wanted to address the meeting briefly, and then we're bringing all the main speakers back to discuss with each other what they thought about the meeting, and that it's been a really, really interesting meeting so far, and I'm sure that's not the end of it yet. Okay, Tony, 3 to 4 minutes, please. I've sent you a message that you have to unmute. It should be on your screen.
All right, yeah, no. Okay, thank you, comrades. I agree with Norman on most of the things that he said. I don't agree on the question of free speech for fascists. I don't think it's difficult to know what fascism is. It's like pornography here, even if you can't define it, you recognize it when you see it. Fascists don't discuss the obscure points of philosophy at meetings. And if Norman's ever been at one, he will know that. When Jewish ex-servicemen came back from the war in 1945, they found a resurgent fascist movement being organized by Oswald Mosley, and they formed the 43 group, which spent the next few years destroying their meetings. What were their meetings about? They were about inciting racial hatred against the Jewish population of the East End. I mean, my father told me there were streets and roads in the East End that someone who was Jewish could not walk down without being attacked. And in that case, you have to defend yourself. And that means denying free speech. When someone uses free speech in order to deny the humanity of other people, that's not free speech. But let's move on from that. I've been involved in anti-Zionist and Palestinian solidarity work for over 50 years, probably longer than Norman even. And I do think we have reached a point where we can say we can see the beginning of the end of Zionism and the Zionist movement. And Norman's pointed to the contrast between the reaction to the latest Gaza invasion and what happened in 2014. I agree. I think there have been a number of reasons, but I think crucial and critical amongst them have been the two reports, firstly by B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch, both defining Israel as an apartheid and as a Jewish supremacist state. And I think the chips are up for Zionism in the sense that they can continue to accuse people of anti-Semitism, but it has less and less effect on people. And the irony is, and it is an irony, that the anti-Semitism campaign that has been waged against supporters of the Palestinians actually has the effect of increasing anti-Semitism, because what it says to people is, if you support the Palestinians, if you oppose racism, if you oppose Zionism, if you oppose what happened in Gaza, then you are anti-Semitic. So it presents people with a binary choice. Either you oppose the oppression of the Palestinians, or and you therefore support the persecution of Jewish people, or you're anti-Semitic. So obviously people will say, well, that is a greater evil, therefore I will oppose what's happening to the Palestinians, even if I am termed anti-Semitic. And in a sense, the person who really spelt out what the Zionists were involved in, it was George Orwell, when he said political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. And an example of this total hypocrisy is the attack on David Miller. At the Education Select Committee, Robert Halfon addressed the Education Minister, the Universities Minister, why would you not intervene? Tell Bristol University and the Vice Chancellor that enough is enough. We're not living in 1930s Germany. And another MP, Jonathan Gullis, the MP for Stoke-on-Trent, asked the government to impose tougher sanctions on universities which do not address accusations of anti-Semitism. He mentioned in particular Goldie Osuri at Warwick University, quote, "We need to start sacking people. Until we start bringing that kind of scrutiny and action into our university sector, then we will never progress." And it really reminds me of the saying of Hadjo Meir, who was a survivor of Auschwitz, when he said anti-Semitism used to be when people hated Jews. Now anti-Semitism is when Jews hate someone else. And that is how anti-Semitism has been redefined. And I think we saw these double standards and this hypocrisy with the demonstration in London only 2 weeks ago, 200,000 people. There were a few posters which basically said, Israel is like Germany was before the Holocaust. That, as Tina has said, is not anti-Semitic. But what was noticeable was the Israeli demonstration the next day, literally 200th of the size, where Tommy Robinson and his fascists were welcomed onto it. They were heroes amongst those who were demonstrating. The Board of Deputies was actually booed because it had criticised the appearance of Tommy Robinson, and yet the press was almost silent on that fact. That just goes to show this is not about anti-Semitism. And you have someone like Eric Pickles, who's—
You wind up now, Tony, please.
Sorry, the British delegate. I need a couple more minutes because I do want to make this point. You have someone like Eric Pickles, former president of Conservative Friends of Israel, the delegate to the IHRA. This is a man who supported Ray Honeyford, the headmaster in Bradford, who was supported also by the British National Party for the article he wrote in the Salisbury Review, attacking black parents. This is the man who defends the Tory Association MEPs in the European Parliament with out-and-out fascists like Robert Zile, who marched with the Latvian veterans of the SS. And yet, when it comes to Israel, he's opposed to anti-Semitism. These are the double standards and the total hypocrisy of Zionism's supporters. And I don't think we should be afraid of taking them out, because the actual message is Zionism has never had any problems with anti-Semitism. You can see that with Netanyahu's friendship with Viktor Orban. Orban, who won a general election on the basis of attacking George Soros as a Jewish financier. Orban, who described the pro-Nazi ruler of Hungary during the war, Admiral Horthy, who presided over the deportation of nearly 500,000 Jews to Auschwitz, as an exceptional statesman. So we need to point that out. that if in fact there was anti-Semitism in the ranks of the Labour Party or on campus or amongst university professors, then the Zionist movement wouldn't be at all concerned. And the best example of that, if you want to talk about Labour anti-Semitism, go back to the Second World War. The Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison, he denied entry to 2,000 Jewish refugees from France, children and elderly people, on the bogus pretext it would cause anti-Semitism, even though 80% of public opinion supported it. What did the Board of Deputies say? Absolutely nothing, because they too agreed with him that Jews should only go to Palestine. So that is the hypocrisy of our opponents. And so I think we should be absolutely in support of the right to speak out on Palestine and Zionism. And when David Miller says we should see an end to Zionism, he is absolutely right. That does not mean an end to Jews. It's only Zionism which conflates Jews and Zionists, Jews and Zionism. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody. I'm just about to bring in the main speakers again. We're going to start with Ilan because he has to leave us soon. But I just wanted to mention, and that's been put to me by Deepa, who's involved in the Julian Assange campaign, that we give our solidarity to Julian from this meeting, who is still in prison 5 months after he won his case, absolutely illegally, an affront to human rights, etc. He's been held in lockdowns 23 hours a day in isolation. It's an absolute travesty. There's a protest outside Belmarsh prison on July the 3rd. If comrades can go along to that, that would be really appreciated. So I'd be really pleased with this discussion. It's been very interesting. Bring in the main speakers now for 2-3 minutes each, perhaps, to pick up on some of the points they would like to discuss further. So first, Ilan, please.
And thank you for allowing me to jump the queue. I'm sorry, I have another obligation, and I would have loved to hear all the others, but I know it's recorded, so I will listen carefully. In a very short, I don't even need 3 or 4 minutes, and I don't have even 3 or 4 minutes. But the first point is, I think it's very, very important to continue and fight against the allegations of anti-Semitism that are weaponized in order to stifle criticism of Zionism by insisting that anti-Zionism is anti-racism, is anti-colonialism, and give a badge of honor to anyone who's anti-Zionist and tell them you're an anti-colonialist, you're an anti-racist. I think we should really change that conversation. We should not try and explain again and again that we are not anti-Semitic if we oppose the Zionist ideology of settler colonialism, that is an ideology of displacement and replacement of Israel, which is a supremacist ethnic state. I think it's time to tell people that we think that these things are obvious now, 74 years later, and therefore insist on us being on the right side of history. And the second point is, because this is a forum of free speech, I fully understand it, but I do think that again, it should be. I'm not sure that this is the only context for discussing Palestine. I think racism in Britain is a far more important framework for discussing racism in Israel. I think the fact that Britain still acts as a colonial state in Britain itself towards Black people, towards Caribbean people, towards the fact that Britain doesn't even allow one life seeker to cross the channel. I think these are all things that are interconnected, and they will make us a far more powerful a group of solidarity if we do not allow either Israel or Britain to enjoy exceptionalism in our critique on dehumanization, ongoing colonialism, neocolonialism, and neoliberalism. I think this could also expand the networks of identification, the networks of solidarity, as we have seen in the reaction of Black Lives Matter to the situation in Palestine, and as we saw people in Gaza demonstration demonstrating in solidarity with the people of Ferguson. These are the issues that I think are the only ones that would change the imbalance of power on the ground and turn it into a very different balance of power, where the Palestinians are part of a coalition that is against the coalition of evil of Britain, the United States, and their supporters in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilan. Much appreciated to have you with us today. And before Moshe comes in now, could I urge comrades, please join the campaign. 8 people have done so in this meeting. It helps us to plan for meetings, to produce placards for July the 20th, etc., produce banners. We had a really good lobby outside Bristol University, but these things cost money, and your membership fees will go towards things like that. Thank you. Moshe, you're next.
Thank you. I just have 2 things to say. One, the first one is in reaction to what has been said or claimed before. I'm an academic, but my academic field has nothing to do with Zionism or imperialism or colonization. I am a mathematician by academic profession. I want to warn against academic conceit. Academics did not invent, for example, the exposure of colonialism. Political militants and political scholars did a lot of work before the field of post-colonial studies was ever invented, or even before the inventors were born. Similarly, the truth about Zionism was exposed by serious research, in serious research by people who were not academics in that field. They were militants. Let us not engage in academic snobism or conceit. Academics have done very good, sterling work, but they did not invent it. Okay, I'm speaking as someone who I think is older than all the people here who have disclosed their age. I remember the Nakba from personal memory. So I was old enough to actually read the papers at that time, so I remember it. What my views were is another matter. The second thing I want to say is, yes, there is a shift, and it began by saying it, and when I first noted the shift, some people that are present here questioned it, but I think now all of us agree. Norman was very explicit about it. It's true, there is a shift, and in these terms, you know, we have one section of public opinion, but don't be too hasty in saying, yeah, no, we are winning. Zionism is nearing its end. By no means. The struggle is long, and it is of long duration, because the fact of support of the so-called international community, which means the United States and its camp followers for Israel, is based on real facts. It's not just the Zionist lobby or Zionist propaganda. The Zionist propaganda and the Zionist lobby have been dealt a blow in terms of their influence on public opinion. It will be more difficult to legitimize the policy of the imperialists and so on. But don't engage in illusions, because it will be very painful when your illusions are disillusioned. The struggle goes on, and it will go on for very long.
Thank you very much, Moshe. Brilliant. Okay, Saladin, please.
Thank you, and thank you for all the other speakers for sometimes provocative and very informative talks. I want to maybe say why one of the reasons why there is perhaps a sea change is taking place. And I think Salma put it into the chat as well, which is that We're seeing significant changes in the ability of people to pick up and communicate things that are happening in real time, and do it in ways that speak for themselves with images. I think an Israeli government representative once said that if it was down to the war of images, we will lose immediately. And that's because the images say everything they have to say. When you have 10-year-old children standing in front of the rubble of their neighbors' homes, asking where the children are going to live and why they have to face this, it is hard to talk about or argue about self-determination for the Jewish people in a state of their own as being the center of discussion. That has come with changes in culture and discussion, some which are positive and some which are negative. So we've seen changes in vocabulary, which have become amenable and better for these disputes to take place, in that more people today understand terms, or at least have some grasp on terms such as colonialism, settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and a colonial state, etc. Right? So these terms have become much more a currency in which people can exchange ideas in a growing way. I'm not saying by any means that the whole of the public have a grasp on them, but they are growing. And that has been part and parcel of the sea change in discussion. There are also, with this movement, there have been changes in understanding of legitimate and acceptable speech. So there is a part of this movement that is dedicated to this idea that the way you define acceptable speech is against what offends people as oppressed groups. So it's oppression. People who are oppressed get to define their own oppression in terms of what they feel upset by, hurt by, or offended by. And there's a problem with that. I mean, whilst we should never, ever ignore the experiences of the oppressed about their specific experience of oppression, that is not the be all and end all of a discussion about what counts as oppression and what does not. And the best example of that is the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which has been sold on the basis that this is how Jews define their own oppression. And of course, that means silencing all those Jews that don't wish to define their oppression in that way. But we nevertheless need some limits. And it's the last thing I'm going to say. I'll wrap up with this point. There was a lot of discussion about whether free speech should be allowed or not allowed, what the extent of free speech should be, what counts as free speech, etc. And there was a mention of fascism as well. Historically, it's worth locating that slogan, right? That slogan, that no platform for fascist slogan. That slogan was not introduced by movements and people who just didn't want to hear fascists talking, right? Who thought, oh, well, if we hear fascists talking, we'll be offended. It's terrible for us. The reason the no platform for fascist program was slogan was introduced historically was because it was known at that time that the way that fascist movements operated, recruited, and had influence was through holding meetings in which they engaged in violent incitement or incitement to violence. And there's a problem with trying to talk about immediate incitement, by the way. It's more complicated than that, because I can say, well, straight after this meeting, we're going to go and beat up the minority that lives down the road, right? That's immediate incitement. Or you can say, in 2 weeks' time, we're gonna storm the Reichstag, right? So you have to be careful about how your definitions of immediate or non-immediate violence, etc., are put into play. But incitement is important, as it is with hate speech. In this country, the laws on hate speech don't say you just can't say things that are hateful. They say you cannot incite people to hostility to a specific group, right? So you cannot try and manipulate them to try to take hostile actions or hostile attitudes to a particular group. So one has to be very careful about the lines and definitions, but they do reside in that ballpark, which is incitement and action, or as Norman was pointing out, empty speech, which is basically direct and directed abuse, which is where I would agree with him on that. There is one final point. I'm sorry to have gone on. Moshe's point about it being a long struggle. Think about the struggle against South African apartheid. The world woke up to South African apartheid and what it really meant a long time before South African apartheid was overthrown. It wasn't like, suddenly everybody wakes up, they become conscious, there's a movement, and then South African apartheid goes. It took a long time of fighting the establishment, fighting the media, and fighting one government after another that wanted to collaborate with it. So it is a long struggle, and the darkest hour of the night is just before dawn. We will see some very dark hours in the near future.
Thank you very much, Saladin. Excellent. If I might just say that, I think there's a difference between free speech for fascists, racists, etc. And, if they attack us, we attack them back, of course. But, fighting their ideas might be a different matter. But we will actually be discussing this in a meeting of the campaign, a members meeting that's forthcoming in the next few weeks. Limits to free speech or not. This is clearly a very, very important discussion, and I hope comrades join the campaign to participate in these discussions and further meetings. Okay, the next person to come back is Salma, please. Awesome.
Thank you. I won't dwell too much on the freedom of speech issue because I think I made my stance clear, but just as an example, I feel quite strongly that Muslims are on the receiving end of some pretty horrific, racist hate speech, and we're not protected. But for me, it's not about whether the law is going to protect us or not. It's about the political and cultural and social environment we're in. Winning on a technical legal issue isn't going to cut it. So just yesterday, the Daily Mail, I mean, I know you can always kind of expect this kind of thing, but it is still frightening where they're talking about no-go areas for white people where Muslims live. They talk about Muslim parents of disabled children who don't care about their children and are just milking the benefit kind of money. They talk about all the worst kind of things which would make you kind of feel revulsion and hatred. And on top of it, fear. That they're putting into people that somehow Muslims are patrolling the streets and denying them, other people's freedom of movement. All of this is totally legitimate, even under, well, it has been allowed. We know that actually being Islamophobic is a badge of honor for politicians now. It's not seen as anything that they will be ashamed of, which is why we've seen what's happened in the Labour Party around Islamophobia. When I say what's happened, as in what's not happened, as well as what's not happening in the Tory party. So for me, that let's not get too distracted. And B, we don't even have the kind of power to stop people or not. Anyway, so let's focus on what we can do something about and where our energy can be marshalled. And for me, without repeating what I've already said, but to emphasize that when it comes to this issue of Israel and Palestine, that as long as Israel feels it can act without impunity, there is no rational basis for it not to carry on doing what it's doing. If you're a country that can get away with doing what Israel gets away with doing, why would you change? And my answer to that is, it can only change when the international framework which allows it to do so. So I'm not appealing even to Israelis within Israel. I think, we're beyond that. The reality is this: even before the Second World War, even before the Holocaust, the kind of migration that was facilitated after the Balfour Declaration by the British government was about changing the demographic realities on the ground. This is an issue going back 100 years, not just to the latest atrocity last month. And as long as Israel is given the weapons, the political cover, and the arms to do it, nothing's going to change. And if anybody needs convincing of that, look what happened with Biden. He stayed silent for days upon days whilst Gazan children were being bombed, whilst homes were being obliterated. And it wasn't until the mobilizations in America, in Britain, in Western countries and countries around the world that he decided to make a statement which put pressure on Israel for the ceasefire. So this is what the realities are. And we have power as British citizens to have a say in that, to make it politically expensive for our government. At the moment, and I think this is an important point because, people, with the focus on Israel, to put it in the context of Western foreign policy. It is not that Israel is wagging the dog, as it were, because this is part of the kind of anti-Semitic tropes that, you know, this huge, you know, Jewish conspiracy. It's that Israel has aligned itself to interests which the West perceives are its own interests, whereas I don't think they actually are. In fact, they contribute to instability, not just in the Middle East, but around the world. And as Western governments can see that the price isn't worth it, if their own citizens are not happy with it and are questioning where their money is going, you know, a lot of the stuff about us trying to get Israel to do the right thing, which is not going to do, because it's not in its interest to do so. You know, there's real interests here, which we have to be real about. And we've seen instances, not many, but instances in the 1980s and 70s when America said, you're not going to get that next grant, Israel, unless you kind of behave yourselves. And Israel always pulled back. That's the leverage that we have, which is not being deployed. And has been pointed out in this meeting before, as the Israeli regime understands public opinion is turning against it, it will deploy all means necessary. You know, it's doing it in Palestine. Just yesterday, you know, the Al Jazeera journalist being manhandled, arrested in full view of the world, you know, because they know they get away with so much. But now they're relying on silencing, not allowing the news to get out, and also silencing critics in the West where they fear a change in public opinion will turn off the taps. That's the material interest here. And that's why we are in the front line, guys. That's the bad news. That actually we are the bulwark here. We are the people trying to still make that stance, because they want to make it expensive for people like us to speak up, to make it easier to stay quiet, to think about our jobs, to think about the bills, to think about the mortgages, think about our reputations, and fear. So they are using that tool of fear. And that's why meetings like this, actions like this, where we come together, where we can see all the wonderful work that's going on, the solidarity, the humanity, and give heart and courage to each other, as well as take heart and courage from the people on the real front line in Palestine, who actually haven't given up, who for the first time since 1936 actually are united in a way that they haven't been, whether it's the Palestinians within Israel itself, in the Gaza Strip or Jerusalem. This is a real moment. And so it's a perilous moment, an exciting moment, a moment full of potential, but it's one where we have to hold that line and keep and take strength from one another. So my last thing would be to reinforce, yes, it is always darkest before the dawn. And it's important that we look out for each other, we look after each other. When they go for one of us, we all stand by that person, whether it's Norman, whether it's Salahuddin, whether it's David Miller, whether it's Jackie Walker, whether it's me, whether it's people whose names you may not hear, but we are filtered down. Our strength lies only in our unity, and don't let them discourage us or divide us. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Salma. Spot on. It might get nastier, but we have to stand up and stop it. Otherwise, it will never end. Unfortunately, we've had a few trolls joining us in the last minutes of this meeting, but I think we had to switch off the chat. Apologies, comrades, for nasty stuff that's been posted. Okay, the last, no, not last person, the next person to come in is Tom Hickey from BRICUP. Hello, Tom.
Hello, thank you very much. I think that what I won't take very much time at all, but I want to start by doing my best to upset Norman a little bit more. But I want to upset him by agreeing with him, agreeing him fundamentally on what he had to say about the things to be done now. In other words, if I understood him rightly, to go on the offensive, to hold the meetings, to raise all the questions about the nature of the Israeli state, to the nature of what is being done, and indeed to have a debate and an argument about what the nomenclature should be, whether we're going to use Jewish supremacy or Jewish domination, or exercise the resonance of the concept of apartheid. I think he's absolutely right about that. And it's for that reason, for instance, that I would urge you, if you are friendly with an academic, or you are currently an academic teacher yourself, to start by signing the academic commitment that BRICUP is being organized to declare as an individual that you will not participate with Israeli institutions or support them in any way. That's the first thing that I would urge on people. The second is to urge you, if you are in or around the university as a student or a lecturer, to become involved in the campaigns that will now be being launched in those universities, in the university and colleges union branches, about adopting pro-BDS positions as a whole series of universities are now about to do. The UCU Congress is voting right now on the IHRA definition, and it's voting on a motion about Palestine and the importance of individuals making a moral and political decision about whether they're going to work with oppressors in Israel, Palestine, or whether they are not. And signing the academic commitment is one way of making that quite clear. And lastly, I would urge anyone who is interested in what is going on to take notice of the ways in which the Israeli lobby has been extremely successful, for instance, in getting the BBC to remove some of its documentaries that are dealing with Palestine because of complaints made to it by the Board of Deputies and by other pro-Israel lobby groups. And BRICUP has itself been involved in a campaign with one of the world's major publishers, Pearson International, who, in respect of 2 school books for British children and for those doing GCSEs as international students, have got Pearson to transform one of their textbooks about the Middle East conflict from a relatively well-balanced account into what is effectively a pro-Israel lobby. And if anybody's interested in that, I would urge you to go and look at the BRICUP website and to seek out the report on that publishing scandal. That's been a report that's been written by John Childcraft and James Dickens of BRICUP, 2 professors of Middle Eastern studies. On the question of free speech, you're going to be having a meeting to discuss this yourselves, so I won't take much time about that. I would just urge Norman to listen carefully to what is being said, a little bit more carefully, because nobody was suggesting that they were going to interfere with his independence or take away his right, or indeed actually his duty to read and to teach Mein Kampf if that's what he wanted. Nobody was suggesting any such thing. And I have a complete respect for the concern that he obviously has about the independence of his mind and that nobody should take it away, and nobody is trying to take it away. But I would suggest, Norman, that history actually tells us something about the relationship between speech and action, that they're not entirely separate. And when fascists organize meetings and they organize demonstrations and they make even remarks that aren't directly about violence or its immediacy, those are the views that are then transformed into the attacks that take place on Muslim communities, on Black communities in this country, and on Palestinians elsewhere. So I think that we have to be very, very careful about drawing some abstruse philosophical distinction about freedom of speech on the one hand and the actions that take place on the other. Speech and action are not that distinct. We have to make careful judgments about when we're going to exercise what follows from recognizing the junction between them.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, the next person is Deepa.
Thank you, Tina. Firstly, I'd like to send solidarity to Goldie, David, and other colleagues across the UK who are, including Saladin and Sean, who were picked up by the Jewish Chronicle a couple of weeks ago. This kind of attack, as Salma rightly pointed out, is intimidating, and what I would like to say, particularly to the trolls who have joined the meeting and those who have been asked to leave, is that the kind of behavior that we see actually strengthens the kind of commitment we have to resisting the attacks, resisting the kind of attacks that are being made on oppressed people everywhere. I'd also like to send solidarity to Norman, because I've seen the kind of horrendous attacks that have come upon people like him and himself. I'd like to conclude by, just by pointing out a few things. Number one, the use of networks, of course, an area which David has studied widely, but also you can see very clearly in terms of the attacks on David Miller, the use of the APPG on anti-Semitism to put pressure on the University of Bristol's Vice-Chancellor to terminate David's employment and to shut him down. And the use of many other similar networks to intimidate, scare, and silence people. And this becomes particularly bad in situations where people do not have their own alternative networks of support. particularly our precarious workers and those who are at the start of their academic career, or indeed those who have been in precarious jobs for 14 or 15 years, like many of our members have been at UCU. The second is the weaponization of neoliberalism, which is the use of student voices or voices which are supposedly more legitimate to silence legitimate criticism of Israel, or indeed legitimate criticism of war crimes taking place elsewhere. Thirdly, the weaponization of positive values towards negative ends. So things that we take for granted, for example, respecting the human rights of others, respecting the anti-racist credentials, etc. These are things that are being used to silence people. And this means that a lot of the false left or the faux left tend to fall in with those who are oppressing other people. And we need to resist this, and particularly those of us who are within the left of the Labour Party need to recognize that Keir Starmer's leadership is putting us in a position where many people are being misled as to what the Labour Party should stand for, and indeed many have had the scales fall from their eyes, seeing his behaviour over the last year or so, and indeed before, as you can see in the case of Assange. Fourthly, it's about muddying the waters, as, you know, talking about completely different things, or indeed tying in very legitimate criticisms with very, very dangerous things that cults do in terms of rewiring the narrative. And for us to be cautious about that, and also to recognize that there are many attempts being made to trip people up, and therefore we have to be slightly more aware of what we are saying. And lastly, and I think this is really important, is to recognize the links between academic freedom and free speech. They are separate things, but they are both important. And to draw upon something that Tom said, we can't just think that being left is about taking the knee and saying Black Lives Matter. The lives in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Palestine need to matter in real terms. And if we can get those to matter, because we oppose the wars there, and we also oppose those who silence, those who reveal the wars, or those who silence people like Julian Assange, then we can really show resistance to those who are oppressing. And I would urge all of you to show solidarity with Julian. I can see from the meeting that there was quite a lot of solidarity in the chat, and to be really conscious that right now the defenders of human rights, the defenders of civil liberties are as much under attack as the oppressed people in some ways, in order to prevent debate, in order to prevent discussion. And it is indeed very heartening to see about 200 people were at this meeting today, and I certainly found it very educative. And I'd like to, as a member of the Labour Campaign for Free Speech and a steering committee member, I'm really grateful that this event was organised. And thanks to Tina and Esther and others who were coordinating in the background for organising it.
Thank you, Deepa. I've just noticed the reactions are still working, so you can put your reactions into the chat, into the meeting, but we're getting lots of trolls trying to join. Okay, Norman, I'm glad you're still with us. If you could stick to maybe 3-4 minutes. Oh, sorry, you're still muted. Hold on, you need to unmute. Did you see a message? You should see a message on your screen to unmute. There we go.
I'm just going to limit myself to 2 points. Point number 1, everything you want to say about fascism, how speech culminates in horrific acts, horrific deeds, one has to be sensitive to the links between the connections between speech and deeds. All of that was said with regard to Marxism and communism. So you start with a few speeches, then you end up having Stalin, and they say you killed tens of millions of people when you have the Gulag. So the argument was, just as you say with fascism, why not nip it in the bud? And that was a strong tendency in American Supreme Court jurisprudence. It was called the bad tendency theory. Bad tendency theory meant we know where this is going to end up. We know that fascism ends up in concentration camps and gas chambers. We know that communism ends up in gulags and famines. So we should nip the bad tendency in the bud. Every argument you make against giving free speech to fascists, exactly the same arguments were made against giving free speech to communists. And then there was another side to the argument in the Supreme Court jurisprudence. The other side said, even if their speech is wrong, be it communist or fascist, when the US was mostly communist, even if their speech was wrong, they did have some interesting things to say. Their critique of capitalism was not without any merit. And therefore, we should let them speak up until it presents an imminent danger. Why do I bring this up? Because it was the communists and their supporters who argued so vehemently for the distinction between speech and conduct, speech and acts. And it was that distinction that enabled, ultimately, it took a long time, enabled the free speech of communists, notwithstanding, as Tina suggested, communists did advocate the forceful overthrow of the government. But the decisions ultimately, and they came belatedly, of the Supreme Court were, even if they do advocate the use of force and the overthrow of the government, we should nonetheless let them speak up until that red line, because they have interesting things to say. So the whole history of jurisprudence on free speech in the United States was defending the right of communists to say exactly what you say fascists shouldn't be allowed to do. You're giving the argument for bad tendency, which would mean suppressing Tina, suppressing all comrades who believe at some point armed force may be necessary to overthrow an illegitimate government. So you should think about, it's the most elementary principle of logic, applying your principles across the board and seeing where you end up. And if you apply your principles across the board, you make the perfect argument for suppressing communists. Number two, Moshe, it's a long struggle. I agree. Will I be there to see the rendezvous, be part of that rendezvous of victory? No. And in fact, I don't believe there is ever a rendezvous of victory, but that's a separate point. The thing is, you lived a long life. You got to do what you want with your life. You were a mathematician, and spiritually, I assume you thrived in your life. And I had many choices, and I am happy with the choices and where I ended up in life. You can't just say to people, it's a long, long struggle. Communists, yes, they said, you know, the communists tomorrow, it's a long struggle. But along the way, they built trade unions. They improved the lives of people. The struggle is not just about the end. It's also the process of getting there. And so I think we have to also, as we tell people it's a long struggle, we have to focus on things that can make a real difference in people's lives. And that's why I agree with the last recommendations of Human Rights Watch. They said, they recommended to the PLO, they have recommendations to Europe, to the United States, and they have recommendations to the PLO. And the recommendation to the PLO was, for now, forget about political goals and focus on human rights. Focus on the human rights. I think that's a wise piece of advice. I don't expect actually wise political advice from HRW, but in this case, I thought it was wise advice. I translate that to mean We should focus now on ending the blockade of Gaza and ending the land confiscations in the West Bank. Those are two goals which would significantly improve the lives of ordinary people. And in my opinion, they are realizable. Not easy, but it is a victory that's possible. And so we can't just say it's a long struggle, which it is, but we have to also convey to people that there are ways there are possibilities to realistically, concretely improve the lives of people who, for 73 years, many of them, refugees and their children, really haven't seen a happy day in their life. I mean that literally, because I had some close friends who were refugees, and that's what they said to me, and I actually believe it. So I think we have to focus on what Human Rights Watch says. For now, let's stop talking about one state, two state, binational state, democratic, secular state. Let's just focus on lifting the siege of Gaza, ending the land confiscations in the West Bank. Those are realizable goals. They can win over public opinion. They can put pressure on governments and do something, the Jews call, do a mitzvah. Maybe it's not communism, but do a mitzvah, improve the lives of the people.
Brilliant. Good ideas, Norman. Thank you. Tony wants to come back for a few minutes, and apologies, we're running late, but it's been a really good meeting. So thank you. Tony, hold on, you have to, can you see the message?
Yeah, okay, thank you. I mean, very briefly regarding the free speech issue, and we have dealt with it in some detail, my view is the same as that of the Irish Republicans, ourselves alone. We never call on the state to ban anything, but we do call on the movement to make sure, in the words of the Spanish Republicans, no pass around, that the fascists shall not pass. And I think there are reasons for that. In response to Moshe, I agree that we're not going to see the overthrow of Zionism for a long time. But I think we are at the beginning of the end. And I say that because one of the main goals of the Israeli state, as was outlined in the Reuters report in 2010, a response to BDS, was that they sought to combat the delegitimization of Israel. What they meant by that was what we've seen this year, the reports on apartheid. Most people now who know anything about Palestine accept that Israel is an apartheid state. That's even been mentioned in the US Congress for the first time. We have got over that battle. Of course, it will be a long and very bloody struggle, but at least we are starting to go on the way. The third thing I want to mention is about David Miller. One of the reasons he's been attacked is what he said about the Israeli state using Jewish students as pawns at Bristol University, which of course has been twisted and mangled. He didn't call the students pawns, but he said they were used as pawns. And it reminds me really of what Barnaby Rain wrote very recently, when he said that there's been an overt campaign to use Jews. He said, once they saw us as dangerous Semites infesting European society, now instead we are their favorite pets, heroic colonists in the Middle East and successful citizens in the West. The fact is that Jews have been used as a wedge against revolutionary movements. For example, in Central and South America, against the Sandinistas and against Hugo Chavez, accusations were made that those movements were anti-Semitic. What we saw against Corbyn was not for the first time, and in fact it began with when the French took over Algeria, the Crimea Decree, which made Algerian Jews French citizens. They singled out Jews as their collaborators. None of this that we're seeing is new. When they make Jews into heroes, it's for a very simple reason. They want to give moral legitimacy to their own reactionary imperialist agenda. That's why I say we must fight. And I say to everyone else, please join the campaign, because we need you to fight for free speech, both in the Labour movement and the Labour Party and outside on Palestine and Zionism. Thank you.
Quite right. Thank you, comrade. Well done. Comrades, I think this has been a really fascinating meeting. Sorry, we've overrun a bit, almost 3 hours. Sorry about that. But I think it was really worth it. And as the fact that there's still 150 people in the meeting shows that you also thought it was worth staying for. So thank you very much. And please join the campaign as Tony says, we will be discussing and come to a decision, will we, on free speech, unrestricted or not. I think there will be another long meeting to discuss this, but you have to be a member to get involved in that. We also want to put on a public meeting, because we're for campaign for free speech, on trans issues. But we've been discussing that for some time, how to put it on. Even I think saying trans issues is leading. I don't know. We don't know. We haven't got to grips with putting it in a way that doesn't offend yet before we even start the meeting. But we think as a campaign on free speech, it's hugely important to discuss the issues involved in this issue, which has been splitting the left in a number of ways, which is in a very unhealthy way. So we're trying to think of a way to discuss these issues in a comradely manner. July the 3rd, as we mentioned, Belmarsh Prison, a protest in solidarity with Julian Assange. If you can get to it, would be fantastic. And July 20th, protest outside Labour Party headquarters in favor of free speech. I also really liked Salma's suggestion for a roadshow of universities in support of academic freedom and free speech. That's a pretty good idea. We can probably do it together with some student unions that dare to stand up, and even encouraging them to stand up in the process. So thank you very much for staying with us so long. Apologies for overrunning. And if I'm not sure if I should ask comrades to unmute themselves now. I think we might get abuse from the few trolls who are still hiding. Apologies, so we're not doing that this time. But thank you very much for joining us, and we can wave, we can see each other. Thank you. And thanks you to all the speakers. Bye-bye.